I'm going to begin by repeating the words of Elizabeth Minich. Whites are taught to think of their lives as morally neutral, normative and average, and also ideal, so that when we work to benefit others, this work is seen as work that will allow them to be more like us. That's uncomfortable. Well, I think the most important work from a pulpit should comfort the afflicted and afflict the comfortable. My white friends, we are very, very comfortable. The quote comes from the groundbreaking essay, White Privilege, Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack, which was written by Peggy McIntosh, who was quoting one of her colleagues. She wrote those words 32 years ago. The opening quote to her essay goes, "I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on any group." I'm going to read that again. I was taught to see racism only in individual acts of meanness, not in invisible systems conferring dominance on my group. Now, I can relate to this. I grew up in the Deep South. My grandfather on my mother's side fought in Europe in World War II, was injured, and came home. And then he farmed, growing southern staple crops, including tobacco and cotton. By the time I was born, he had retired and sold off almost all of the farmland. He was, as the saying goes, a man of his generation. I think I probably heard the N-word from him or my grandmother hundreds, if not thousands of times. But they weren't racist. No, I mean, they used the term in the most benign of ways. Simply using it referred to any person of color whose name they didn't know. Couldn't have been racist, right? I didn't see any acts of meanness. Now, I saw the deferential way the black folks acted towards my grandfather, especially older blacks. Now, even as a child, it felt wrong in some way that I couldn't really fully articulate back then. But of course, I didn't question it. It was just the way it was. Now, fast forward to high school. I worked at an after-school job with a pretty girl. We flirted a little, and I could tell, even as a clueless teenage boy, that she liked me. I liked her too. There was a problem. She was black, and that just wasn't done. This was in the 1990s in Georgia. Now, that pretty girl, she would even go on to win homecoming queen at my high school. Now, sure, I'm bragging a little that the homecoming queen had a little crush on me. But nothing racist happened, right? It was sad, but there were no individual acts of meanness, just two star-crossed lovers, right? Yeah, my grandparents were almost certainly racist, to some degree or another. Mainly, they also benefited immensely from the systemic racism of the Jim Crow South. As a middle-class white family operating a large farm, they profited on the backs of black farm laborers who had almost no educational or economic opportunities, far less access to civil liberties, especially when compared to my white grandparents. It's also blatantly, abundantly obvious today that systemic racism, the social norms that kept kids of my generation segregated, if not on a social basis, then certainly on a romantic basis, they still existed in my childhood in the South. Fast forward to my working years. April and I moved to Birmingham, Alabama in the early 2000s. Now, at the time, I was a manager for a large electronics chain. I was transferred to the store that was located in Irondale, which is part of Birmingham. For those not familiar with that area of Birmingham, at the time and still to this day, is often called the Hood. I was the only white manager when I arrived, and of the several dozen employees in the store, there were only 2 or 3 whites. The store was considered by corporate a problem store. And within a few months of my arrival, the entire management team was white. Now, about a year later, April and I would leave Birmingham. The day after I left that store, the company went through a major restructuring and many of the top salespeople were laid off. That included a black man who I had nominated for management training and had been at the store for many years. At the same time, a white guy who had been around for a few months had also expressed interest in management training, and he wasn't let go. And he was also good friends with one of the managers. Now that, my friends, is what white privilege looks like. The black guy had no advocates, no allies. The white guy was connected. You can't get a seat at the table if you can't get a seat at the table, friends. Now, what about here? What about here in our lovely Conejo Valley? There's no systemic racism here, right? No institutional bias against people of color or marginalized groups. Or is there? Let me offer up the biggest, most obvious evidence that I can think of. We have complete lack of diversity in our own community. I say where there's smoke, there's fire. Yeah, sure. Maybe nobody said, let's make sure to keep the black folks out when Thousand Oaks, the city plan, was created. But it was entirely built on white privilege. Sure. Maybe much of it was clueless and largely unintentional, but those policies were still immensely exclusionary. The demographic makeup of the Conejo Valley is a product of housing policies that have for decades made it impossible for marginalized populations to move here and share in the upward mobility that the whites that live in the Conejo Valley benefit from every single day. We at Chalice fight for justice and equality, right? We want deeply for our religious home to be a place where all feel welcome and can find their own religious purpose. But we live in a community that's never really put out the welcome mat for blacks. Let me give you some data. About 6% of Californians are black. About 8.5% of the residents of Los Angeles County are black. Ventura County, 2%. Thousand Oaks, 1%. But it's not racist, right? No individuals committing mean acts. I hope you see my point. I know many of us struggle with the idea of white privilege and institutional racism. It's defined by things that whites don't even see and never experience. The fact that they're invisible to many of those who benefit can make it nearly impossible to comprehend. It's also not easy to acknowledge that your own success isn't entirely a process of your own skill and hard work. Again, white privilege is largely defined by the things that we never experience. Not having to deal with being stopped by law enforcement simply because you're driving a nice car. Being questioned and having your bag searched while white colleagues walk right past unmolested into the same building to attend the same meeting. Having to go by your middle name on a resume because Jamal doesn't get called for interviews. Feeling relief when your son is born with light skin and fair hair like his white mother, and then feeling the guilt for your relief. And then having to explain to your dark-skinned son that the rules are different for him when, not if, but when he encounters law enforcement. Those aren't made up examples. Those are stories that I've been told by friends of color, experiences that they've lived, simple anecdotes that don't even begin to scratch the surface of daily experiences that whites never even know about. unless we listen. I never for a single moment live with those worries or fears. Like I've said a couple times, maybe that's why the concept of white privilege is so hard for some to accept, along with systemic racism. If you never see it, it's hard to comprehend. Now let's look at the other side of that. How have I benefited? As a starting point, I don't have to compete with many Jamals for the same job opportunities. Moreover, like the story of the guy from the electronics store, simply being born white means I'm more likely to already be connected to someone in a position of power. The color of my skin alone is like being born on second base. People of color have to hit a double just to get where I'm already starting. What can we do about it? What can you do about it? What can I do about it? This can seem like a hard question to answer, and it is. And I can't answer for each of us. I can only answer for myself. I do have ideas, though. If you're a business owner, you're a hiring manager, make sure people of color get called for those interviews. And then most importantly, prioritize diversity in your hiring decisions. There is clear evidence that businesses that value diversity do better. Now, advocate and vote. Vote for policies that increase access to affordable housing in our communities. Vote with your wallets too. Do business with minority-owned businesses. Think about that story that Sam shared with us. Many of us now, we're like the king, completely unaware of the suffering around us and the immense privileges that we have simply by being born what and who we are. But who do you want to be? Do you want to be the king? Or do you want to be the dog? Most importantly, don't give up. We're about 250 years into this grand experiment called the United States, and much progress has been made. And while it may seem like it's impossible to truly find justice and equality for all, everything seems impossible until it isn't.